Thanks, Ricky, and the band. Good morning, everyone. It's good to see you. We're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 10 this morning. So if you have a copy of it, it will be on the screen, but we're going to read all of it together in a few minutes' time. We've been exploring Matthew's biography of Jesus and the particular focus that Matthew places on how those historical facts regarding Jesus' life and his teaching authenticate his claim to be God's Messiah. And last week, Stephen took us through chapters 8 and 9, where Jesus goes throughout the regions of Galilee and does the kinds of things that only Messiah could do. And one of the key things, the key themes that emerge from those two chapters is the theme of discipleship. Jesus is beginning to take on disciples. And of course, at the most basic level of any disciple is following. And so time and time again in chapter 8 and chapter 9, Matthew emphasizes this repeated word following. So Matthew 8:1 talks about when Jesus came down from the mountain, great crowds followed him. Matthew 8:10 says when Jesus heard this, he marveled and said to those who followed him, truly I tell you, I've not found anyone with this kind of faith even in Israel. Matthew 19, a teacher of the law came to him and said, I'll follow you wherever you go. You go into Matthew 9, Jesus sees a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth, and he says, follow me. So, I don't need to make the point any more than that. It's pretty obvious that there's this repeated emphasis on following Jesus over and over again in chapter 8 and 9. That's what it means to be a disciple. Most basic entry-level understanding is to follow Jesus, to go where he goes, to be involved in what he is doing. And now in chapter 10, Matthew's going to show that the next element of that, the next dimension of what it means to be a disciple of Jesus, is not simply just to follow Jesus and observe and see and be there present as Jesus does what it is he does, but to actually get involved in it yourself. The disciples' orientation of what being a disciple really actually involves now in chapter 10 is going to take on a new level as they discover that integral to being a disciple is getting engaged in representing and witnessing to Jesus in society. At the end of Matthew chapter 9, Matthew says this. It says that Jesus went through all the towns and the villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and healing every disease and sickness. And that's kind of a roundup, kind of synopsis of all that Jesus has been doing in the previous two chapters. And then in verse 36, he says this, when he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. And then he said to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask or pray that the Lord of the harvest, therefore, will send out workers into his harvest field. And chapter 10 of Matthew begins by showing us that Jesus is actually going to make the disciples part of the answer to their own prayer that Jesus has commanded them to pray. Because he's initially now going to send them to these sheep without a shepherd for a short season into this harvest field to work and to represent him as envoys and emissaries to tell the people that the king is here. And that's not uncommon for God to stir us to pray about a situation that he's actually going to use us to be the answer to. Sometimes praying about something is a deflection from having to actually get engaged. I'll stay here and I'll pray. In other words, don't ask me to get engaged. But often praying about something is how God shapes our hearts and knits our hearts to the very situation that he is then going to call us beyond just praying to get involved with. And even though in the 13th century some scholar decided to put a big chapter 10 in between Jesus calling his disciples to pray for this and then Jesus calling his disciples to then be the answer to that prayer. Matthew's thought flow hasn't changed. One flows straight into the other. And here's what he records in Matthew chapter 10. And I want to just give 5 minutes of the time that I have to actually just expose ourselves to the whole of what it says, because this is going to be more authoritative than anything I can say tonight. So let's read together the whole of Matthew chapter 10. And it says this: Jesus called his disciples to him and gave them authority to drive out impure spirits and to heal every disease and sickness. And these are the names of the 12 apostles. First, Simon, who's called Peter, and his brother Andrew, and James, the son of Zebedee, and his brother John, and Philip, and Bartholomew, and Thomas, and Matthew, the tax collector, and James, the son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, and Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. These 12 Jesus sent out with the following instructions: do not go among the Gentiles or enter any town of the Samaritans, but rather go to the lost sheep of Israel. And as you go, proclaim this message: the kingdom of heaven has come near. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those who have leprosy, drive out demons. Freely you have received, so freely give. Do not get any gold or silver or copper to take with you in your belts. No bag for the journey, or extra shirt or sandals or staff, for the worker is worth his keep. Whatever town or village you enter, search there for some worthy person and stay at their house until you leave. And as you enter the home, give it your greeting. And if the home is deserving, let your peace rest in it. But if it is not, then let your peace return to you. And if anyone will not welcome you or listen to your words, leave that home or town and shake the dust off your feet. Truly, I say to you, it will be more bearable for Sodom and Gomorrah on the day of judgment than for that town. I am sending you out like sheep among wolves. Therefore, be shrewd as snakes and innocent as doves. Be on your guard, because you'll be handed over to local councils. You'll be flogged in the synagogues. And on my account, you will be brought before governors and kings as witnesses to them and to the Gentiles. But when they arrest you, do not worry about what to say or how to say it, because at that time you will be given what to say. For it will not be you speaking, but the Spirit of your Father speaking through you. Brother will betray brother to death, and a father his child. Children will rebel against their parents and have them put to death. You will be hated by everyone because of me, but the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. When you are persecuted in one place, flee to another. Truly I tell you, you will not finish going through the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. As the student is not above the teacher, nor the servant above his master. It is enough for students to be like their teachers and servants to be like their masters. And if the head of the house has been called Beelzebub, how much more the members of the house? So do not be afraid of them, for there is nothing concealed that will not be disclosed, or hidden that will not be made known. What I tell you in the dark, speak in the daylight. What is whispered in your ear, proclaim from the rooftops. Do not be afraid of those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather be afraid of the one who can destroy both body and soul in hell. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground outside your Father's care, and even the very hairs of your head are all numbered. So don't be afraid. You're worth more than many sparrows. Whoever acknowledges me before others, I will acknowledge before my Father in heaven. But whoever disowns me before others, I will disown before my Father in heaven. Do not suppose that I've come to bring peace to the earth. I do not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to turn man against his father, a daughter against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and a man's enemies will be the members of his own household. And anyone who loves their father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Anyone who loves their son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Whoever does not take up their cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Whoever finds their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. And anyone who welcomes you welcomes me, and anyone who welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. Whoever welcomes a prophet as a prophet will receive a prophet's reward, and whoever welcomes a righteous person as a righteous person will receive a righteous person's reward. And if anyone gives even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones who is my disciple, truly I tell you that that person will certainly not lose their reward. Okay, well, it's good that we have about 7 hours to cover all of this. It's obvious already that I am not going to be able to cover any of this in detail. So this is the tasting menu version of Matthew chapter 10. And don't worry, there won't be 9 courses, which probably doesn't make it a tasting menu. But this is the trailer version of Matthew chapter 10, where we're just going to highlight some of the dynamics, and then I'm going to hand it over to you in home groups and on your own to develop. I want to just highlight 4 things over the course of the next 20 minutes, just to think about, and just things that have spoken to me over the course of this passage. And the first thing, as we think about witnessing to the Messiah, is this, is that witnessing to Jesus the Messiah is a delegated matter. Matthew begins in chapter 10 by telling us that the 12 disciples are brought to Jesus and he gave them his authority. That's the first thing that he does before they're sent out. He gives them his own authority and power to do what it is he wants them to do. And as we have been following Matthew's story over the course of these weeks and months, we've seen that a big part of Matthew's biography of Jesus is this emphasis on how much Jesus' authority was recognized by the people he came to. You remember at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew summarizes the crowd's response by saying that they were amazed because he taught as one who had authority, not as their teachers of the law. Remember the centurion last week whose servant was gravely ill. He recognized Jesus' authority as somebody who didn't even need to be present in order to heal his servant. He didn't even feel he was worthy to have Jesus in his own house. Such was his recognition of Jesus' authority. And then again, in Matthew chapter 9, Jesus heals the paralyzed man by saying, in order to heal him, Jesus does it so that he will demonstrate that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. So much emphasis has been given to this authority that Jesus has in terms of his supernatural power and how what he teaches conforms with reality, the truth that he is teaching. That authority dimension is perhaps the hallmark of Jesus' ministry. But now that power and authority is going to be delegated because God believes in delegation. The God of the Bible is a God who believes in giving real responsibility for deeply significant things to other people. He's the kind of God who creates a perfect world and plants a beautiful garden, and then gives it to a man, a bachelor who hasn't read Jordan Peterson, in order to tend it and look after it and be responsible for it. He's the kind of God who, when he wants to witness to the ancient pagan nations, doesn't just do it all by himself, but raises up a people in order to be that light to the Gentiles. And now we see that as we move into this even greater dimension of the witness to the world of who God is and what God has done in Jesus Christ, Jesus isn't going to do it all by himself either. He's going to delegate it out. He's going to empower people in real and meaningful ways. And he gives them his authority. He doesn't just ask them to come up with their own authority. He gives them his own authority because that's where real authority lies. For any of us who speak, it's always tempting to try and source elements of authority and credibility in our education, or in our knowledge, or in humor, or in rhetoric, or in aesthetics. But remember what Paul said when we looked at 1 Corinthians chapter 2, that he didn't come with lofty speech. He didn't come with great words of wisdom. He came with the message of the cross. Why? Because that's where the real authority lay. It's the gospel that has the power of God to save, not these other dynamics. And that is what Jesus gives them. Now, there are two levels to this briefing that Jesus gives, because after he's given them authority, he then sits them down and, in a sense, gives them a briefing about what it's going to involve. And there are two levels or two contexts to it. The first context is the immediate context of Jesus sending these 12 out into the cities and into the towns and the villages of Galilee. That is what verse 5 through to verse 15 is all about. But the context of verse 18 through to verse 42 is different. It's broader. And it's really important that we see the difference there. That Jesus is giving, in this first part of chapter 10, a specific calling with specific instructions to specific people at a specific moment in history. And so we cannot and should not draw certain applications for us today from that particular passage. And in fact, it's very clear that Jesus is doing that, because in the first thing that Jesus says is that they're not to go to the Gentiles. And he also says that then they're not to take all these provisions with them. This is about the king's emissaries, the king's envoys, going to the people. And as such that this is the king's people, he has a right to expect that they will respond to his envoys in an appropriate way, at least through hospitality. So they're not to take provision for that journey. But later on in this passage, things shift. And in fact, Luke 22 makes it very clear that things have shifted, because there is a big difference between what's going on in Matthew chapter 10 and what's going on in Matthew 28. Because in Luke 22, Jesus then says, remember I told you when I sent you out the first time to not go to the Samaritans? Remember I told you not to take provisions with you? Now it's different. So Matthew 10, 5 to 15 is not Matthew 28. It's a specific calling. And in fact, the reason why we know that is because later on in verse 18 of Matthew 10, there are Gentiles involved in this mission. And in the second half of Matthew chapter 10, we see that this mission is going to be extremely difficult and it's going to cost an awful lot. But actually, this first mission was extremely successful. So there's a difference there. We're not to use Matthew 10, 5 to 15 as an application for what it means for us to be involved on any given occasion. But later on, there is specific application. But the basic point is this: Jesus delegates real responsibility. He could do it better than we could ever do it. He could be involved in that in a much more effective way, but he doesn't do it. He engages real people. And Matthew lists the names of the apostles who are involved, and they're all different. Their experience is different, their skill sets are different, their education is different, their communication skills will all be different. But yet they're all involved in different ways by being commissioned. They're all given the same authority, the same power to represent the same person. And I find that encouraging. God doesn't call people into his witness, into his mission, into effective representation for him in the world by a cookie-cutter approach. He uses our skills, he uses our backgrounds, he uses our histories. Whether we're ashamed or disappointed by those histories or their skill sets, whether we can point to other people and assume that they're going to be much more effective for this kind of stuff than we are, Jesus chooses who he chooses. And the most important quality to have for this responsibility is not the right history, not the right education, not the right skill set. but the right authority. That is priority number one. Secondly, another thing that just sat out for me in this was that witnessing to Jesus the Messiah is a costly matter. I'm sure that sat out for you as we looked at this. Look at the realism in verse 16 onwards, where Jesus says this. He says, I am not sending you out like sheep, or I am sending you out like sheep among wolves. Now, generally when sheep are put among wolves, they're torn to pieces. But he says, be shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves. Be on your guard, because you will be handed over to local councils. You'll be flogged in the synagogues, and on my account you'll be given over to governors and kings as witnesses to them. He talks about brother betraying their own brother, father betraying children on this basis. You will be hated, verse 22, by everyone because of me. This is a really sobering dose of realism about what it actually means to be a witness to Jesus in the world. This is not how advertising is usually done, where you keep the costly part or the unpalatable part in the small print. Jesus is upfront about what expectations they're going to need to have about how they're going to be responded to by the world. Because if the world responded to the king in this way, then why would we expect it to be any different for the king's envoys? And what would happen if Jesus hadn't shared this, and out the apostles and the disciples go in order to witness to the world, assuming we have the King of Kings, surely the world will embrace him, and then suddenly they're rejected and they're persecuted and they're martyred? What would that do to their faith? How on earth can Jesus be truly king if this is happening to us? Unless Jesus had warned them before that this was going to happen. And so rather than those kinds of experiences damage or dismantle their faith, rather than opposition undermining their faith in Jesus, the fact that he's told them that this is what they are to expect actually confirms his words rather than undermine it. And we're all aware from the stories of church history that Jesus was right. This is what happened. Paul said that anyone who desires to live godly in Christ will suffer opposition. They will suffer persecution. I used to enjoy is the wrong word, but be so challenged by reading the great stories of the martyrs down through church history. I remember standing in Broad Street in Oxford, where there's cobbled in to the tarmac is an X-shaped structure with cobbled stones. And that is the point where Latimer and Ridley were martyred in the 1500s for their faith. And we're all aware of how much so many people have and do today give up for all their faith. And yet, even though that might seem like a distant thing for many of us, really struck me when I read verse 25. Jesus said this. He said, look, if the head of the house has been called Beelzebub, how much more will the members of the house be recognized in that way? Now, Beelzebub, of course, was the prince of demons. In other words, they associated Jesus with one of the main figures of evil and danger. And whether or not we're familiar with people who are actively persecuted, I think increasingly so in our society, loyalty to Jesus, particularly in areas of ethics and social values, is increasingly being associated not just with being old-fashioned, but with being immoral and with being evil. That loyalty to Jesus, if this is actually what he said, is a clear and present danger to human well-being and societal stability. Which means that anybody who's going to be associated and loyal to those kinds of moral visions and way of life is going to face the same accusation. I don't think the challenge, certainly in my generation and below, is any more that Christianity is irrational or that it's irrelevant. I think the real challenge is now that it's immoral. that Christians are on the wrong side of history. And if they're going to associate that teaching with evil, as happened in Jesus' day, then a servant is not greater than his master. But what's really interesting is that one of the emphases that Jesus gives in regards to the cost of being a witness is relational. Take up your cross and follow me is given by Jesus in the context of family loyalties. And this is one of the greatest challenges. This is what Jesus means by bringing a sword and dividing fathers against sons and mothers against daughters. Not that this is what he has come to intentionally desire to do. But the reality is that loyalty to Jesus in a world that is ultimately against him and among people that don't like what he says is going to bite, particularly at the level of relationship. There is a huge cost to following Christ, but often the greatest cost is in the area of the most intimate relationships. I remember a friend of mine, my good friend, the late Nabil Qureshi. Some of you might know his story. I remember talking to him about his own cost. Now, he grew up in a devoutly Muslim family. After a couple of years of investigating Christianity, came to faith. And basically overnight, his family rejected him. I remember him telling me that his parents weren't present at his wedding because he was a Christian. They weren't present in the early days of the birth of his daughter because he'd rejected Islam and embraced Christianity. And in a sense, as much as Nabil faced abuse in many different ways, that was the hardest cost that he had to bear because he loved his family. And his family, in a sense, loved him. And we may not be overly familiar with that because many of us live among families and among friends where there isn't that kind of immediate relational cost. But it may well be, and Jesus is so real about this, that we have to be prepared to accept that there may be relational costs. And it happens in this country where somebody becomes a Christian and that creates tension in the family because parents have a certain expectation of their children, and then that child becomes a Christian and wants to go in a different direction in life, and the parents see all the potential and had great hopes that the child will go into a certain area of work, and now the child is going to serve overseas or going to be involved in something, or the parents don't like that a child is associated with a particular group that's loyal to Jesus because it's a little embarrassing. These are the challenges. Many of us have kids who are right now in creche or in the house at various activities. We have no idea, as invested as we are, as much as we try to be the best parents that we can, as much as we pray, we have absolutely no idea what choices and values those children will take on. We can't control it. And the chances are that there could be a sort of division that comes between the choices and the values that our very children adopt and that we hold to dearly, where it becomes a choice between loyalty to Jesus and loyalty to our loved one. And that's real. And Jesus is so honest about it, that this is what it's going to be. The cost is real. Thirdly, and quickly, witnessing to Jesus is a safeguarded matter. So not just a delegated matter, not just a costly matter, but it's also a safeguarded matter. Because as much as Jesus is clear and honest about the realism, and as much as that realism is intimidating, Jesus isn't going to leave us as sheep without a shepherd as we get involved in this. Sheep without a shepherd are inherently insecure. They're totally vulnerable to the elements, to predators, to the hazards that they may come across as they meander, unguided by anything but instinct. And as much as Jesus in talking about the cost of following him and witnessing for him, doesn't make any promise of removing us from those kind of pressures or intervening so that those pressures and costs are relieved. What he does guarantee is his provision in the midst of it. Because here's what he says in verse 19, the end of verse 19. He says, "At that time when you're brought before Gentiles and rulers, it'll be given to you what to say. It will not be you speaking, but the Spirit of your Father speaking through you." He goes on to say in verse 26, "Don't be afraid of them, for there's nothing concealed that will not be disclosed." He says in verse 28, "Don't be afraid of those who can kill the body, but rather focus on those who can kill both body and soul in hell." And then he says, "Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground outside your Father's care. And even the very hairs of your head are all numbered. So don't be afraid. You're worth more than many sparrows." Jesus 3 times in the midst of all the intimidating things that he said, says this: don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Not because that there isn't anything that they might face that will induce fear, but for 3 reasons. 1, because the truth that they proclaim is going to be revealed to be right. One day, every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. One day, when history is properly measured and evaluated, those who are loyal to Jesus will be on the right side of history. Second, he says that you're not to be afraid because ultimately our destiny is secure. Don't be afraid of those who can physically injure. It's not pleasant. It's not something nice to think about. But ultimately, even those who have lost their lives have not lost. And finally, he says that don't be afraid because God is aware of it all and values you infinitely. You're seen, you're known, you're safeguarded. This is not a numbers game. It's not that Jesus is saying, look, if enough of you go out, yes, some of you might be fodder and pawns in this, but eventually we'll win at the end of the day. That's not what this is about. Jesus is saying even the very hairs of your head are numbered and understood and recognized. God is not absent from any of it. He's not unaware of any of it. He's involved. He sees. And he's committed. And finally, final thing that just sat out for me is that witnessing to Jesus the Messiah is an eternal matter. All the things that Jesus says in this passage are important. But there are 3 things that he says or that he expresses that are of particular importance. And the way that we know that is because he emphasizes it by saying, truly I say to you, truly I say to you, truly I say to you. Verse 15, he says, truly I say to you, it will be more tolerable on the day of judgment for Sodom and Gomorrah than for that town. Verse 23, he says, truly I say to you, you will not have gone through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. And in verse 42, he says, truly I say to you, whoever gives even a cup of water to a disciple of mine because they're a disciple of mine will by no means lose their reward. These are promises, but they're all promises that point to the future. And the reality is that our witness today is inseparably linked to the future, to the eternal world, to the reality beyond the reality that sits in front of us. Because here's the thing, what an encouragement it must be to know that these might be some of the challenges, to know that this might be some of the cost, and yet God is going to use our witness to be some of the very case studies that he presents to people in evaluating their lives and in bringing ultimate justice. How they respond to you will depend on whether it's more or less tolerable for them than a city like Sodom. How they respond to you matters. It just brings such a sense of value, but it also brings a sense of responsibility. Because if that is true, then in some ways it means that we have to live flexibly. Jesus says in verse 23 that when you're persecuted in one place, flee to another. And I tell you, you will not finish going through the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. In other words, and this has happened to many Christians down through the years, that if you're persecuted, it's okay to move. It's okay to leave. That's what happened to the apostles and to the disciples in Acts chapter 8. They were persecuted, they moved. But when they moved, they got on with doing what they'd been doing. They got on with witnessing. Priscilla and Aquila were kicked out of Rome. It wasn't easy, it wasn't pleasant, but they got on with doing what they were meant to be doing, and God used it. But you can only live with that kind of flexibility if this eternal reality is real. You're only able to count that kind of cost and know that it's worth it if the eternal reality, if rewards, if being on the right side of history is going to actually happen. And so that's the challenge. Is it real? Is it real for us that this is worth it? That this cost is real, but God has delegated us with so much opportunity and responsibility, and we can't take it lightly. Is it real that no matter how difficult the cost might be, even relationally, that one day it will be proved right, and we will live in the reward and in the value of those difficult decisions where we chose Jesus over everything else? Because Jesus finishes by saying this, verse 32. He says, everyone who acknowledges me before men, I will also acknowledge before my Father who is in heaven. But whoever denies me before men, I will also deny before my Father who is in heaven. So we just take a moment and just pray together as we round things off. Jesus called his disciples to him and gave them authority. As you go, proclaim the message that the kingdom of heaven has come near. I'm sending you out like sheep among wolves. You will be hated by everyone because of me. If the head of the house has been called Beelzebub, how much more the members of that house? But don't be afraid. There's nothing concealed that won't be disclosed. Don't be afraid of those who can kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Don't be afraid. You're worth more than many sparrows. Don't suppose I came to bring peace on earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. And whoever does not take up their cross and follow me is not worthy of me. But if anyone gives even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones who is my disciple, truly I tell you that that person will certainly not lose their reward. Father, sink this into our hearts and help us to capture what it means. In Jesus' name, amen.